Thank you very much, everybody, for joining me here at the beginning of the ecosystem talks today. My name is Andrew Williams. I'm really excited to be speaking at this, my first ever GoLab, but also my first ever Go conference. So I hope that what I have to say is interesting and relevant. I'm glad to see a few people turned up. If you talk about graphical user interfaces and Go, two potential outcomes to that conversation, either a fair amount of interest because there's not a lot going on, or a reasonable pushback because that's not what the language was designed for. But I reckon that maybe there's a lot of interesting stuff here to cover, and that's why I'm here. So just a little bit of background, because I don't know anybody here really. I've been a developer for around 20 years. I've worked on lots of different projects in various companies. Open source has been a big part of that from early days, and it continues to drive me forward now. I've been working in front-end and back-end, mobile apps, desktop apps, and of course the obligatory web as well. But today I'm specifically talking about native graphical applications. And I'd like to just start by explaining that Fyne was not created to be a graphical toolkit for Go. I didn't learn Go and say, this needs a graphical toolkit, let's build one. It happened a little bit more organically. When I first thought up this project and the need for it, I didn't even know Go. Thankfully, it's very quick to learn when I needed to, but at the time, I'd heard about it, but it was not something that I was fully aware of, and the details and so forth. But if it wasn't created for the Go ecosystem, then why? Why another GUI toolkit? I guess this is the biggest question. Why do we need another one at all? I ask myself this regularly because it's a pretty big undertaking to even think about such a project. But in my work with various different graphical platforms, whether it's Linux desktop, iOS mobile, Android, and everything in between, I think I have one summary. They're really hard. They're difficult to learn, can be complicated to work with. And I have a suspicion that the huge adoption of web technologies, Electron, and hybrid applications might just be because native applications are that much more difficult than crafting some HTML and CSS and putting it into an application wrapper. And I even stretch to think that perhaps open source graphical applications could be more prolific if there was just an easier way to do it cross-platform. But there's various different challenges in this area at the moment. The graphical toolkits that we know and love or hate are largely based on legacy technologies, thinking that might have been cutting edge or appropriate at the time, but the world has moved on. Thread management is the first thing that comes to mind. It's not really a problem that a huge number of people here are going to sympathize with, perhaps because Go has just done this so well. But if I'm programming an application for native mobile, perhaps, and I want to change graphical state, and I'm in a background service connecting to a web system, I have to switch thread, I have to appropriately update the context, and then switch back out and continue with my processing. This was needed a while ago, but is now not really part of what's necessary. And like I hinted at, these were largely created a long time before web services. Cloud hadn't even been heard of. And it's quite clear that there is a very big mismatch between the way that graphical application toolkits have been designed and the world that we live in now. I think also the learning curve has been really quite steep. It's C basically, or C++ under the hood. You might have syntactic sugar on the top. There may be object models built on top of it, or a completely new language, but you're binding to the same things underneath, which is why we see things like thread management becoming part of the context that you have to work with, even when you're in a modern language. And memory management is the joy that, again, hopefully we don't have to worry about, but it's really part of all of these toolkits. It's complex to do these things well and efficient, and they pass a lot of that on to the developer using the toolkit. And also, tooling can be quite sparse, or it can be huge. You might have a text editor and a compiler and some API documentation if you're lucky, or you might be thinking, I'll use this great new toolkit, and here's the getting started download, and 40 gigabytes later, your internet connection has been maxed out and your hard drive is full, and you can't unzip the file to get started with a Hello World program. Naming no names, but I'll be around later. And I'm sure everybody can sympathize with this one. Multiple platforms is really tough. And why not have a language that just makes that really easy for us? Compiling for different architectures should be a thing of the past. A lot of systems have pretended or aimed to achieve that, but there's a long way to go still. And lastly, data synchronization. I mean, any graphical application is going to be working with a lot of data. And if you're going to be on lots of different systems, I think I have 4 in front of me right now, and all I'm doing is talking from some slides, then not being able to have the same data with you all the time is a pain. And why should application developers have to worry about that? So that's just a really long way of saying, I think we need a new graphical user toolkit, a modern toolkit, something that's simple, really, really simple to learn, powerful, and performant. And I don't think it's a really long stretch to see when I was exploring these ideas that Go just really fit that idea quite well. And so Fyne was born. It's come a long way since then, don't worry. But let's have a look, I suppose, at the vision there. This is what I thought it could be. The best toolkit for easily developing beautiful native graphical applications across all platforms. I really mean all to the fullest extent. If it has a screen on it, I think we should be able to target it. Anyhow, enough of the background. Let's have a look at the design. Starting with the API, now it might not seem like the smartest place to start if you're talking about the design of a graphical user interface, but if we're going to be doing something that is clean and simple, the API has got to be the first place to start. An idiomatic API was important. When I picked Go as a language, that was the idiom that we needed to stick to. And part of making sure that it's consistent with the language, obviously, is to make learning really straightforward. We have documentation that follows on from the Go documentation. So if you like tours, you use the Go tour to get started, and then you pick up the Fyne tour to take you on to building your first graphical application. And self-documenting as much as possible. The Go doc is just really a great example of that. Also on there, being extensible was quite important. We want something that's really, really straightforward and simple so that you can get up and running very, very quickly. But also, it has to be possible to do more complex things, because as much as it would be great if everything could be done with a really simple API, we're not going to be able to do absolutely everything for everybody. And then there's the design of the user interface itself. We have not exactly followed, but been heavily inspired by the material design specification. There's a lot of really good stuff there. It's built completely on vectors, vector graphics, which obviously just means that we are able to scale to all of the different device resolutions, output formats that we need to, which is quite a bit above some of the raster-based systems where you would need to have, here's my image for 1x, here's my resolution for my image for what you might call retina resolution, and then you've got the retina and a half and the 2.5. And if you're able to use vector graphics, that's a great way forward, and Material does that really, really well. We've definitely imported their iconography. I'm no graphic designer, but a really smart start. And we ship a light and a dark theme by default. You're free to provide other themes in your application if you would desire, but basically we didn't know if light or dark was going to be the preferred version, and a little bit like in the UK, it would probably come down to 52-48 splits, so let's actually do both, because life is about choices. That's pretty much the design, how it might look to somebody who's working with the toolkit. But the last part that was really, really important for us was that this should work across all of these devices that we're supporting with absolutely no runtime dependencies. I don't want folk to have to worry about the version of the library that they're using, to have complex up and running documentation for the end user. It just doesn't really make any sense. And we weren't able to do that right from the very first day, but that's where it is now. We're able currently to target Mac, Windows, Linux, BSD with no dependencies, assuming that you have a graphics card and a graphics driver installed, which I hope isn't too onerous for anybody on Windows and Mac. Obviously, that's going to be there. On Linux, you might need a few header files, but it's not too much hassle. And maybe there's other platforms that I'll talk a bit more about later on. So I just want to talk a little bit about the architecture. If anybody here is thinking they might give Fyne a go, this is something that's going to be really helpful to just understand where we're coming from. Obviously, for a graphical system, you've got windows and menus and various bits and pieces that are pretty straightforward. But when it comes to the contents of a window, it's kind of up to the toolkit to define. We've used the term canvas to describe the contents of a window, which might be the full screen, it might be a small portion. Canvas objects are those things which are going to drop into a canvas. They're ultimately going to be what is rendered. We have a set of primitives which would be familiar to anybody who's worked with a Canvas API before. And that's what our drivers are going to be making sure the GL or the hardware can render. Container is then a collection of Canvas objects, because not many applications are going to be useful if you only have one item on screen. Containers are pretty straightforward. They can also have a layout, which is then able to determine how small a window can get and how the items within it are going to be laid out. Then we have widget, which I think should be pretty straightforward, but in our world, that's basically a container with some interaction. The API for a widget, it's important that it is just about the behavior of the widget. How the widget renders, all the details about that are hidden away, not a concern of the person writing against this API. So if you define a widget and you see a function on it, it should be a pretty clear logical change to the state of that widget that you're applying. And then the project itself has quite a lot of packages, some of which I've mentioned before. Keeping them separate, although not necessarily required for a project like this, we thought was very useful for learning. You know, when things are grouped together, they're related, but also it forced a well-structured API between the different parts of the project. The canvas is what defines those primitive canvas objects. If you, for some reason, wanted to write a custom driver, which you'd be welcome to, but definitely chat with the community first. That's a fairly heroic step to be going forward with. But a driver is just implementing the render for those canvas objects, and the rest of the framework is pure Go built on top of that. Layout, which I mentioned before, is what's going to help the containers set things up. So we've got grids, boxes, and some higher order layouts which are helping to put an application in standard layouts. And that's going to get more interesting as we start building higher and higher level functionality on top of what is currently a relatively primitive set of widgets and layouts. The widget package is the widget package. That's the one that we're looking to grow all the time, but definitely keeping it clean, consistent API. And every time somebody suggests, I'd like to include this widget or this functionality on a widget, thinking, is that really something that everybody's going to want to do? Or should we expose a way for you to add your custom functionality on top of what we've provided? So our GitHub project does have a fair number of issues registered for feature requests where we said, well, we like what you're suggesting, but that's not really something we're going to put in right now. And that led to a really interesting conversation about maybe there could be an extra widgets package, which may come, but right now we haven't seen the need for it. And if it was to exist, it would be a separate project. This needs to be lean and simple. The app package I haven't mentioned. This is really the main package, if you will, but with a namespace to keep it separate from the API definition, which is at the top level. That's just so that it's a single entry point. It's going to do all of the detection about the type of device you're running on the environment so that when you create a new application, which I'll show you in a moment, it is going to do the right thing for you, despite independently of the platform that your user is running on at the end of the day. And test. This is something that I've not seen in a huge number of toolkits, especially early ones. I am aware that there are some other projects in Go to build graphical user interfaces or to make bindings to existing ones. It was important for us to create the test functionality really early on. So you can use a test-driven approach to creating fine GUIs, if that's what, and I would actually recommend it if test-driven development is something that you find valuable elsewhere. So when you're designing your user interface, don't just code it up and look at it, but think about how it should function, write your test cases and the test packages there to help validate everything before it ever hits the rendering pipeline. Which, sorry, I should mention, all runs in memory. You never see screen flicker or items popping up. It's executing everything from a logic point of view, and should test it quite rigorously. That's like way too much talking. Everybody wants to be seeing some code, right? So let's look at Hello World. Instead of going line by line, let me just show you this. This is our Hello World application. Apologies for the double import statement, but the brackets added extra lines. I thought big bold text just shows how straightforward this is. Now, I don't really think there should be any surprises here at all. Inside the main function, we're creating a new application instance. We use A for application and W for window. I hope that's not too confusing, but if you end up writing them a lot, that's pretty obvious. From our application, we're creating a new window, giving it a title. That might not be visible on all systems that this is targeting, but it's a good idea anyway. And once we have a window, we're going to want to set the content of it. And in this instance, we're creating a new label widget, and I'm pretty sure that most folk would guess it's going to print hello Fyne in the middle of our window. And then we're going to show and run the window. This is actually a little helper. It's calling show the window and run the application. If for some reason you wanted to start a Fyne application that didn't show a window, you could. In fact, there are one or two use cases, which is why it's separated out that way. You could not create a window, or you could create one and not show it, run the application, and have the window show later. I have done some code comparisons with other systems. We are, sorry, this snippet here, I think is the shortest one out there for a graphical Hello World example, for a native toolkit, that is, sorry. Not by a long shot, but I have found some that are 3 times this length, which blew my mind a little bit. And then I said, well, remember, this is about simplicity for us. For other people, there are different reasons to create these systems. But it's not going to inspire you to write your first application, so let's look at something just a little bit more real. A text editor. As you can imagine, I've not included all of the logic, not filled out all of the taskbars and the menus, but I wanted to just illustrate a couple of ideas here. Initially, we're going to create an entry because that's where you're going to write your text as a user. The toolbar is created next. Again, a pretty straightforward API. Our toolbar is typically full of actions. So we create a new toolbar action, and then we're dropping in an icon from the standard theme, a document create icon. And in this instance, we're simply setting the content of the text to nothing. If you wanted more in your toolbar, you could use spacers and separators, that kind of thing. And actually, the API is extensible, so it's possible to drop labels or more advanced things in your toolbar. Just be careful that you're not doing anything that changes the spacing or makes the theme look a little bit weird. Next, we're creating a status bar, a thing that you might imagine to see at the bottom of your application. We're giving it a label for the row number, a label for the column that you're on, and then laying them out in a horizontal box, the HBox widget just being a helper widget around a container with a horizontal box layout. And then we're setting the content to be a container with a layout. This is kind of where a little bit of the complexity, I suppose, starts to creep in, but we're trying to keep it straightforward. The border layout then says, what are we going to have in the top, bottom, left, and right of our application? So we say toolbar at the top, status bar at the bottom, don't worry about anything else. And then we list the items that should be visible within the container. We put our entry into a scroll container, and that's not listed as a specific border location, so it fills the content of our application. Obviously, I've missed out application setup, window show. It's only 3 lines of code that are missing. I'm not really cheating you too much here. The reason I wanted to highlight out the status bar here is when you want to change something on your interface, what do you have to do? Is there thread management involved? When I get a change here, what do I do to go there? Well, actually, you would just put a callback on the entry so that when the cursor moved, you set the cursor row text to the cursor row in a string format. And the same with a column. That's 2 lines of code, no thread management, nothing to worry about. The toolkit is going to recognize that something has changed and do all of that stuff in the background for you. Well, the main thread, not really the background, but you really don't have to worry about that stuff. Go routines could be all over the place, and this is not going to care about it at all. I really enjoyed working with Go channels for this kind of stuff. In the back end, we've got stuff piping to other stuff, and it just, it's terrible and glorious at the same time. But it means that we can have a really clean API and nothing for for developers against this API to worry about at all. So there is a potential first application that you might build. But I hear you say, how do I get the tools installed? Which IDE do I need to build, and where do I grab all of this from? Okay, you didn't literally ask that, but let's pretend that you did. I mean, GoGet is pretty amazing, right? It's going to handle half of the nightmare about installing anything. So you would just go get fyne.io/fyne. That will download it and install the library, the API. And if you've got an IDE set up, which happens to be your favorite, it should find all of these things. Documentation will pop up, and IntelliSense autocomplete will just work. That's pretty nice. Then set up a project space. I know modules, not modules. However you want to do it, I put that little placeholder in there just to say, let's have a fresh space. Right now, we're just going to create 1 file, but that might expand. I appreciate not many people will think Vim is their IDE of choice, but I didn't want to put anything more contentious up there. I'm not an Emacs guy, sorry. Open your UI Go file. Drop in a hello world, perhaps, something pretty straightforward. And then run your UI. That's it. I mean, the tooling is all there. It's standard Go. There's nothing to be adding. It's just a library dropped in. Naturally, you want to be writing tests, so in this folder, you would also put your tests. Using the test package I had before in the standard Go framework, I don't have a file to show you right now, but I'm happy to run through this with anybody later on today or tomorrow. And then you just test your UI. It will run in milliseconds. It won't load anything up on the screen, but you know that the functionality is working correctly, that your users are not going to have any bizarre surprises when they try and run their application. So we're probably on desktop here. We're getting a window popping up when we run our UI. Pretty straightforward again. What about mobile? Well, it's just like one step more complicated. We have a helper command. Wow, I stepped completely ahead of myself there, sorry. What about packaging? Well, we have a helpful command there that's going to sort it for you. Apologies. So the Fyne command, you get it separately because it's going to install it all for you. If you prefer, you can go into the code that was downloaded already and go install from that cmd Fyne folder. It's exactly the same thing. Make sure you've got an application icon just to hand because it's going to work a lot better if you've got an icon there. You can specify it if you wish or just call it icon.png. And we're just then going to issue the command Fyne package and the current directory. And assuming that your application was myapp.go in the myapp folder, this on a Mac is going to create myapp.app. That's going to be a standard application bundle for macOS. Anybody who's not familiar, it's like a folder with a bunch of stuff in, but if you open it in Finder, the file Explorer, double-click it, it's going to run like any normal application. And if you want to then package for a different system, like this one here, if I want to package for Linux, it's going to add a tar.gz, which we figured is a pretty standard package format. It's essentially going to explode out the appropriate files for your system, your desktop launcher, icons, shared files, that kind of thing. Bear in mind that these are still single binary applications under the hood. We're just putting a bunch of metadata around it. There's nothing too complex here. It's just helping you out. And if you want to install it for yourself, just Fyne install, like Go install, but it's going to install it as a desktop application in your standard runtime space. And now mobile. There's not really any surprises here except for the fact that there aren't any surprises here. Is it sometimes a bit of a surprise? So if I want to target iOS, it's going to create a frustratingly similar looking but entirely different application folder that you could drop into your iPhone or iPhone simulator. If we wanted to target Android, it's going to create an APK off the back there. We're using Go Mobile under the hood, and if I'm being entirely honest, this syntactic sugar hasn't really left my laptop to get to the develop branch of our project yet, but it's that close. I was totally going to have it by this morning, and then I thought I'll finish the talk instead. Fyne install doesn't actually work for this yet. It probably will by the time we have this in production ready, but for the moment, either your Xcode tools are going to be able to install the application into this time it says booted simulator, or you can use the Android tools to install it into your simulator or across the wire into your Android device. That's pretty much all there is to building your application across all of those different platforms. More to come, but this is pretty much what we're targeting right now for our next release. I wanted to show a couple of applications that we do have out there. They're not all straightforward widget-based applications, but also they're not all showing off the widgets we have. I thought it was a nice arrangement. The Solitaire application up there is a pretty good test of the vector graphic rendering speed. If you're running that at 3,000 pixels across the way, that's a lot of cached vector graphics. The Game Boy emulator up in the top right, a bit of a Linux Zelda fan myself, and now I can play that on my PC. If there's a keyboard, you just see the screen. If you're running on mobile, it's going to expand out with touchscreen controls. We've added a couple of APIs to help people decide what to do if they really want to have a difference between platform types. Bottom right, we've got a medical imaging viewer, which my wife told me is a really expensive piece of software to buy and to run, and they're slow and complicated. So we put this together one afternoon. That's running on a Raspberry Pi with a $70 screen bought off Amazon. So for about €75, we've got a medical imaging viewer there, built entirely on free and open source software. No licensing involved. So anything's possible, I guess. And then on the bottom left there, a music player that one of our community members is building, which I just think is completely awesome and given that he's working in the widget area, some of those things are maybe just a little bit not yet landed on our mainstream release either. But it just shows that something really slick is also possible with a very basic set of functionality we have at the moment. And one last thing. Why wouldn't you build a desktop environment if you're building a toolkit, right? We're a special kind of crazy. No, when we were looking at this, we realized that actually there's something about desktop layers, the environments, the window managers, that in some situations haven't moved forward in the way that we felt that toolkits themselves hadn't moved forward. I've got a little bit of experience working with window managers on Linux in the past, and they get big and difficult to maintain, and this is pretty straightforward. It's, again, pure Go using the Fyne rendering system, in fact, it's what I'm running right here. It does work, honest. It's a bit of a side project for us, but we like to dog food, so what better dog fooding can you get than when you're building a toolkit than to literally run your desktop on it? So that's how much confidence we have in what we're doing. Just, I suppose in conclusion, I wanted to think a little bit, going back, thinking forward into the future again. We are going to continue to strive to meet this ambition of being the best toolkit for easily developing beautiful native graphical applications across all platforms. We have a long way to go, but this is what we're really excited about going towards. Some of what I've showed you today, like I mentioned, is not really in our current release, which is 1.1.2. We're going for 1.2 release next month. There's a lot of work to do, but we have a lot of enthusiastic community members. Some are so passionate about this that I was informed last week that 2 of them have quit their day jobs because this is what they're going to do now. So if anybody wants to sponsor the project, that would be completely awesome. We're going to have full mobile support in there, like I hinted at. We're also going to add data binding, think something like MVVM. We've got a working document on our GitHub repository wiki where we're discussing how that could work. And again, one of the community members has that up and running in his own applications, just proving that the concept we've built works. And we're going to make it a lot more easy to write widget extension, custom widgets extending the existing widgets. It's the one thing that has a little bit of boilerplate at the moment, and we're not satisfied with it not being really slick. So we're going to fix that for the next release. 2.0. I mean, if 1.2 was a big release for us, 2.0 is kind of like mind-blowing at the moment. Thankfully, we haven't actually defined the full extent of it, so if anybody is interested or like quite excited about where this might go, feel free to join in and offer your suggestions. We're expecting this will be a graphical GUI editor, something like a what you see is what you get type drag and drop sort of thing. We're trying to figure out where the real value is there so we don't go overboard. I mentioned storage synchronization. At the moment, we have an API for storing user preferences. We're going to extend that for document storage as well. But this has to work across every single platform that your application is deployed to as seamlessly as possible. If I have an application running on my phone and I go off and I want to continue on my laptop, that should work. It doesn't matter what vendor, what company machine it is that you're running. We believe it should be possible to just work across them all. There are technical challenges, there are plenty, but we're really excited to see how that goes forward. And to some extent, we reckon that can be done on all the platforms we're intending to target. A couple of the closed-down mobile ones might involve login screens occasionally. Apologies if that's the case. And multimedia as well. Despite some rich imagery, we don't really have video. There's no audio built in right now. The emulator that I showed you has a really nice audio decoder by the guy who wrote the emulator, and thankfully the two work quite harmoniously for the most part. So we want to make sure that's really easy in the same type of completely simple to learn, easy to build API that the rest of it is built around. And we're not forgetting the desktop as well. There's a couple of really excited folk who want to push this forward. I think realistically, with the amount we've got on our plate, unless our contributor numbers doubled overnight, we're looking early next year to get a 1.0. We did cut an alpha release, a 0.1 alpha, last week because it's stable, it's pretty usable, but it's lacking a lot of functionality that would be table stakes, virtual desktops. I forgot how important they are until I actually used somebody else's desktop environment for a while. We want notifications, and also the widgets, the widget bar down the side. It's a little bit sparse right now. There's no reason why you couldn't write a Fyne widget and just drop it into your desktop. So we want to make those APIs easy, the settings, customization, all of those things completely bundled in. So that's where we are and where we're going. I'd love to open up to questions if there were any around the room. If, however, you have questions and you're not entirely sure whether or not you want to raise your hand, there's a couple of really helpful links here. Apologies about the really long YouTube one. We don't have enough subscribers to get a custom channel URL yet, but I'll share these slides shortly. The tour, like I mentioned, follows on from the Go tour and takes exactly the same style, so pretty straightforward to learn piece by piece. We have developer documentation on our website, which is set out a lot of what I've described today, but with a little bit more detail. Tutorial videos we've just started. I highly recommend, if I may, going to number 4, maybe not straight away, but check it out. It's a quick-ish 10-minute run-through of how to do test-driven development with our test API. So see it and determine whether or not you think it's right for you. And if you're interested in contributing, we have and everything is stored up on GitHub. Like I mentioned before, that's where we do exploration of potential future additions through the wiki. We've got roadmap and things up there as well. There is a really exciting conference that we're going to be running online in November on the 22nd. It will be free. It will be streamed, details of which somewhat to be figured out. I've never done anything like that before, but wanted a chance to engage with everybody who couldn't sit in a seat today or attend a conference of some other kind. We may, if we can figure out how, run some interactive workshops in that space as well. I think lastly, we are on the Gophers Slack server. There's a Fyne channel. There is usually somebody awake, because we've got contributors around the world who can answer your questions. But most of all, we would just love to have people come on, chat about what they think that might be good for them, or just figure out if it's a good project for them at all. And if graphical user interfaces with Go is interesting to you, there are others available. I know that Elias is standing at the back there, and he's got a talk later today, which you should attend. And somewhat apologetically, that project was announced after I published my book on the hands-on GUI application development in Go, which is available from Pact. I'm not saying you should buy it, but you can. Thanks very much, everybody, for your attention. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to take them. I think we've got a few minutes. Cool. Well, thanks very much. And I think there's some time now to change rooms if you want to. Enjoy your day.